You should remember last time when we were talking about mutations, I talked about two different perspectives which you can look at evolution from. There's what's happening under the hood of the car, kind of the nuts and bolts view, and then how does the car handle? That's the big picture view. In order for you to understand the nuts and bolts view of natural selection, we're going to have to get into what's called population genetics. There are a few reasons why taking a population genetic perspective on biology may be difficult for you. You're probably used to thinking about individuals, but remember, it's the population that evolves, and it's the population that we're going to be thinking about when we think about population genetics. So remember, individuals don't evolve, populations do. Another problem is that population genetics can be very abstract. Instead of thinking about concrete specific organisms, we're thinking about numbers. And numbers in particular are scary for some people. A lot of what we're going to be talking about in the next few lectures is going to be mathematical or statistical. If you suffer from math anxiety, this may give you a little bit of difficulty. However, I want to give you a little bit of reassurance. A lot of people are told that they just can't do math. A lot of people believe that they can't do math. There is no one who cannot do math. What often happens is that students get this idea that there are math people and there are non-math people, and they belong among the non-math people. And once they've learned this idea, they get nervous around math, and their brain basically goes into some kind of vapor lock, and then they can't do math. And so that cycle just reinforces itself. They don't feel like they can do math, and so they can't do math, and so they don't feel like they can do it. All you really have to do is break that cycle of intimidation, and you can start to do math. If you need some help with this, or you'd like some help with this, please feel free to contact me and I can give you some tips on dealing with math anxiety or what to do if you feel like you are just helpless in the face of a bunch of numbers. To give you some encouragement in your quest for greater mathematical abilities, I want to hand you this quote from Darwin himself. Darwin tried to learn math, but he found it dull, he couldn't see the point, he didn't keep up with it, and he regretted it. It is very true what he says in this last phrase. Men and women, by the way, who understand mathematics have the ability to see solutions to problems and answers to questions that people just don't see if they don't understand math. It's like having some kind of superpower. And it's worth having because it will really make you not only better in your courses, but it'll make you more valuable in the job market later on. So take it from Uncle Chuck, don't be afraid of math. Okay, let's start learning a little bit about population genetics. What we're going to be doing for the most part in this course is we're going to be considering the simplest possible case that is at all evolutionarily interesting. We're going to be thinking about a single locus, so one gene, with two alleles. So there's two alternate forms of a gene, two alternate DNA sequences that affect phenotype. Most of the evolution that actually happens is really much, much, much more complicated, but if you understand the fundamentals of how a one locus, two allele system works, you can basically apply that knowledge to these much more complicated cases. So here's an example. These flowers are what are called 4 o'clocks, and flower color is determined by a single locus with two alleles. If you are a 4 o'clock plant and you get two A1 alleles, you will have white flowers. If you get two A2 alleles, you have red flowers. If you get one of each, your flowers will come out pink. By convention, in population genetics, you call the frequency of one allele P, and you call the frequency of the other allele Q. Those are the names given to those variables, given to the frequencies of the two alleles. Please remember that if there are two alleles, P and Q must add up to 1. An allele has to be either an A1 or an A2, and those two frequencies have to add up to 100%. There are a couple of basic things that you're going to need to be able to do with allele frequencies and genotype frequencies as we go through the next few lectures. And I want to not just explain to you what you need to do, but I'm going to give you some tools that you can use to do these things. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be doing in these online lectures, is I'm going to be explaining kind of tools or tricks for thinking about these concepts that will allow you to grasp them and manipulate them the way that professional biologists do. Okay, so if you have genotype frequencies and somebody asks you to figure out the allele frequencies, what do you do? Let's say you've got a field of 4 o'clock flowers. You want to know if they evolve. Evolution is a change in allele frequencies, so you need to know the allele frequencies. What biologists often do when confronted with a question is try to reduce that question to the basics, kind of boil it down to a much simpler version of the situation, and that makes it easier to think about. What we're going to do is we're going to couch this whole question in terms of probabilities. Okay, so when you're trying to get the allele frequencies, the way you can think about it is, all right, the first step is to reach into this population and select a random individual. What's the genotype of that individual going to be? A useful tool for keeping track of probabilities in population genetics, or anywhere else for that matter, is a probability tree, which looks something like this. Okay, so you've chosen an individual, and it's going to have some genotype. It's going to have white flowers or pink flowers and red flowers, and you know that each one of those phenotypes corresponds to a particular genotype. What's the probability that you're going to go down this path of the probability tree? Well, it's just equal to the frequency of that genotype in the population. The probability that you're going to go down this path of the probability tree is equal to the frequency of the pink genotype in the population. And the same thing's true for the red flowers in the population, the A2A2 genotype. Okay, the next step is just that you're reaching into the individual you found and you select a random allele. When you reach into an individual with white flowers, which has an A1 genotype, what's the probability that you're going to pull out an A1 allele? Well, it's 1. 100% of the time, when you reach into an individual that only has A1 alleles, you're going to pull out an A1 allele. Same thing goes for the red flowers down here. They only have A2 alleles, so that you know you're going to pull out an A2 allele when you reach in there. The only little wrinkle in it is these pink alleles. You've got a 50% chance of grabbing the A1 allele out of this pink flowered individual. You've got a 50% chance of grabbing the A2 allele out. So you've started by picking a random individual out of the population. You've ended up with one allele or the other. And this probability tree basically maps out the math that you're going to have to do to figure out how likely it is that you get an A1 allele and how likely it is that you get an A2 allele. There are a couple of basic things that you need to know about probability to do population genetics. Unfortunately, they are really pretty basic. Think about it in terms of rolling a pair of dice. Suppose that what you need to do is roll double sixes. There are actually two things that need to happen in order for you to get double sixes. You need to roll the first die and get a 6. Okay, and then you also need to roll the second die and get a 6. And notice that and between these two events. Okay, these are two independent events, but they both have to happen in order for you to get a double 6. When you see the word and, when you're dealing with probabilities, you have to think about multiplying. Okay, so the odds of getting a 6 with the first die is 1 out of 6. The odds of getting a 6 with the second die is 1 out of 6. Because you've got an and here, we're going to multiply. So the odds of getting 2 6s is 1/6 times 1/6 equals 1/36. Okay, both events have to happen, so you multiply the odds of the first one times the odds of the second one, and there you get your answer. Okay, and means multiply. Okay, let's suppose that you're rolling just one die and you need to get either a 5 or a 6. This is a different question. You can roll a 6 with the first die, same thing as you were just thinking about, or you can roll a 5 with the first die. And this is an or, not an and. So there's a 1 out of 6 chance that you will roll a 6. There's 1 out of 6 chance that you'll roll a 5, because of course this has 6 faces. But because there's an or here, you don't multiply them together. You add them. So when you're dealing with probabilities, the word or means you should add. When you do the math, 1/6 plus 1/6 equals 2 out of 6, or 1/3. And those are the odds of getting either a 5 or a 6 each time you roll one die. Okay, knowing that, let's go back to our probability tree. What's the probability that we walk down the probability tree and end up here? There are two ways to get there. What's the probability of getting there through this path? Well, it's the probability that you pull an A1 allele out of the population times 1. Okay, both these events have to happen in order for you to go down this particular path. And so you have to multiply this frequency by 1. What's the probability that you walk down this path, and get to the A1 allele? It's the frequency of the A1, A2 allele times 0.5. And because you can get to the A1 allele by doing this or this, you add those two terms together. Okay, in a similar way, you're going to get to the A2 allele either by going down this path, which happens with a frequency equal to the frequency of red-flowered plants in the population, or you're going to go down this path and then take a right, which happens with a frequency that's equal to the frequency of the pink phenotype in the population times 1/2. Remember that the frequencies of the two alleles are P and Q respectively. Okay, so this is how, if you're given genotypes, this is how you calculate P with this equation right here. You calculate Q with this equation right here. You've got genotypes and you get allele frequencies that way. If you know the allele frequencies in a population, and you want to know what the genotype frequencies ought to be, it's a little more complicated. The population has to be mating more or less randomly for this to work. But what you can do is you can think about the population of organisms as this bag full of alleles. If it's more or less random mating that's going on in the population, then what you're doing is you're rummaging around in the bag. You pick out a random female. She donates one of her two alleles to the offspring. You rummage around in the bag. You pick out a random male. He donates one of his two alleles at random to the offspring. So it's basically as though all of these alleles were washing around by themselves. Mom picks out one, dad picks out one, you stick them together, and you've got a genotype. How do you visualize this with a probability tree? Well, here comes the mom hand, here comes the dad hand, and what do they come up with? The mom hand is going to come up with either an A1 allele or an A2 allele. What are the probabilities of these two things happening? Well, they're P and Q. If the A1 allele is at a frequency of 60%, then 60% of the time, when mom reaches into the bag and plucks out an allele, it's going to be an A1 allele. That's pretty obvious. But what about dad? Well, let's make this probability tree a little larger. When Dad reaches into the bag and pulls out an allele, it's either going to be an A1 or an A2. Let's suppose that Mom pulled out an A1 allele. Where do we go from here? Well, either Dad pulled out an A1 and you get an A1-A1 genotype, or Dad pulled out an A2 and you get an A1-A2 heterozygote. What are the probabilities of taking these two paths? Once you're here, the probability of going down this path is P, the frequency of A1 alleles. Because just as with Mom, the probability that Dad pulls out an A1 allele is P, the probability that he pulls out an A2 allele is Q. It's the same situation down here. If Mom has donated an A2 allele to the offspring, then Dad either pulls out a A1 allele with a probability P or an A2 allele with probability Q. Okay, now we've got our three genotypes. So what is the probability that any randomly chosen offspring in this population will have the genotype A1-A1? Well, in order for that to happen, two events have to occur. Mom has to pull out an A1 allele, and then Dad has to pull out an A1 allele. This happens with probability P. This happens with probability P. So you get this genotype with probability P times P equals P squared. Heterozygotes are a little tricky because there are two ways to form one. Either Mom gets an A1 allele and Dad donates an A2 allele, or the other way around. The likelihood of taking this path to the heterozygote is P times Q. The likelihood of taking this path is Q times P, which is the same thing as P times Q. So the probability of ending up at a heterozygote is 2 times P times Q, or 2PQ. Just as with the A1-A1 homozygote, to get to the A2-A2 homozygote, there's only one way to do it. You multiply Q times Q and get Q squared. So if a population is mating randomly and you know the frequency of the two alleles, these are the genotype frequencies you would expect. P squared of those individuals in the population are likely to be A1-A1, 2PQ are likely to be A1-A2, and the frequency Q squared is the frequency you expect for A2-A2 individuals.